Geopolitics made Africa the investment destination of choice. 37% of you said yes, while an overwhelmingly 63% said no. Well, let's find out why that is the case. We're joined in the studio here by Victor Kgomoeswana, who's author and director. Africa is Open for Business. Victor, very good evening to you, and thank you so much for joining us. So perhaps you could answer this question.
Yes.
Are we turning heads? Are we looking more attractive or no?
Not necessarily, but I want to know, who did you ask that question to?
We're asking our followers, our viewers, yes.
Okay, then I would understand why they would not say particularly yes, because remember, geopolitics would mean a combination of a lot of things,
Absolutely.
But it's regions that become. So let's talk about, say, Europe, where it's going now. Europe is becoming a lot more nationalistic, right? You have a 32-year-old, I think, in Austria who is, if we can say, moving towards neo-Nazi directions, excluding foreigners. When Germany is trying to say, let's take in immigrants, they are going the opposite direction. France is going its own way. And then you look at the US and its conflict with Canada and undoing NAFTA and bringing up a new deal. And then the conflict between US and China. All those things have an effect on Africa. So if you have been looking at Africa as a good destination to do business, the changes that are happening now would not necessarily make it better. Except if you look at the geopolitics of Africa. For example, you had a story earlier on about the Horn of Africa. Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia. The geopolitics of the Horn of Africa looking a whole lot more attractive, because then countries that have been at war with each other are going to be one. So imagine if Djibouti, which although is a small country, is very key, Somalia, Eritrea suddenly combine with Ethiopia. You have a market. You weave it into East African community, then you have a much more stable region. So from that viewpoint, yes. But I would assume people, when you say geopolitics, tend to think superpowers of the world, not necessarily.
So let's start with that. You mentioned the US-China trade war, and you mentioned Europe separately as well, the nationalism, the protectionism. Let's start with the former. Are we benefiting from that? Are we becoming a more friendlier jurisdiction in the eyes of, say, US companies who don't want to deal with China?
No. Remember, China is in the equation whether you are dealing with the US directly or not. Think about it. AGOA says textiles, rules of origin. African countries that benefit from AGOA should be having origination of their textiles in Africa. What has China done? It has moved some of its textiles factories to an African country to comply with that. So the war between China and the US will not particularly make us better, because most of the things that we were benefiting from anyway had to do with a stable relationship between China and the US. So that kind of tussle is going to leave us where, as they say, two elephants are fighting and the grass suffers. We've always been the playground of the US, Europe, and China. So their fight actually might leave us worse off, because think about it, if China is fighting the US, then it's taking a bit of the stuff that we could do with China, the stuff that we could do with America. America can look at some countries that are manufacturing Chinese goods or are doing better business with China as hostile. Because you know how it is. If you're a superpower, whoever is the friend of your enemy becomes your enemy.
Okay, so we'll look by sector and things like commodities, manufacturing, etc. I want to then look at Brexit. The UK was very, very pivotal in the agenda of development aid that Europe has been following. With Brexit, what is the fallout from that, especially for Africa?
It means suddenly where we were trying to negotiate trades as the African Union and Europe, although we were not doing that, we were still having individual countries negotiating. We're going to have to negotiate with the UK and the rest of Europe. So that divorce is not good for us, only because it's finding Africa not organized enough to strike a good trade deal. If we were organized, I wouldn't be worried. But even if we were, splitting a market that was European Union, including the UK, into two smaller markets creates problems for us as Africans.
Traditionally, there has been a lot of concern about negotiation of the EPAs themselves. So are there significant power shifts that are working in our favor?
Well, remember, the UK has a huge command. It's got the Commonwealth, which has a lot of African countries. Lots of African countries are former colonies of the UK. So if your former colonial master is divorcing a union like the EU, what does that mean? There's Anglophone Africa, which is Commonwealth Africa, and then there is Francophone Africa, which is French-speaking Africa, although some members of the French-speaking Africa, like Rwanda, are joining the Commonwealth. So all those divisions and splits are not good for Africa because they are keeping us too busy trying to have way too many connections and discussions, whereas we should having one discussion with Europe.
You mentioned the issue of migration, but there's also the issue of Syria, which many are saying is taking away attention from Africa and its developmental challenges, that we aren't able to refocus those big powers from investing in those issues. Would you agree with that?
I wouldn't, because, hey, Syria is World War III material. So there's no way you can say focusing on stopping a war and conflict around Syria or from it aggravating is going to disadvantage the world. In fact, if you sort out Syria and you stabilize the region, the Middle East, then you are much better for the rest of the world. Because remember, a conflict in that area affects oil prices. And the minute you start affecting oil prices, we import a lot of crude. And when we import crude, we import that inflation that's going to be driven up by...
Victor, let's take a quick break. We'll come back and talk about some of those various sectors, including transformation and other policy pursuits, whether or not they are turning investors away or bringing them to the continent. We'll be back with you in just a short moment.